It is the easiest thing in the world to assume the worst of someone you barely know, especially when you are married to them. History paints the Regency era with ball gowns and stolen glances, yet a marriage of convenience was often just a polite, velvet-lined prison. When the Duke of Waverley finally cornered his aloof wife outside a locked room in their sprawling estate, he expected betrayal. Instead, her desperate whisper, "Don't open that door," unraveled a secret that would break him. Alistair did not believe in love. He believed in acreage, crop yields, and the rigid, unyielding structure of English law. At 32, he was the Duke of Waverley, a title that came with vast estates in Yorkshire, a crumbling townhouse in Mayfair, and a crippling amount of debt left by a father who preferred the gaming tables at White's to the ledgers in his study. To save his legacy, Alistair needed capital. Specifically, he needed £50,000. Rosalind had £50,000. She was the daughter of the Earl of Lonsdale, a man whose ambition was matched only by his ruthlessness. The transaction was finalized on a damp Tuesday in late October. There were no declarations of affection, no lingering touches over the tea service, just the scratch of a heavy quill on parchment, the dusting of sand to dry the ink, and the sudden, suffocating reality that Alistair was now permanently tethered to a stranger. Rosalind was 21. She possessed a quiet, severe beauty, high cheekbones, dark hair pulled back with military precision, and pale eyes that gave absolutely nothing away. On their wedding day, she wore a gown of heavy silk that looked less like a celebration and more like armor. When Alistair took her arm to lead her from the church, her muscles were entirely rigid beneath his hand. He didn't take it personally. He assumed she was grieving her lost youth, or perhaps an unapproved suitor her father had chased off. Women of her station were raised to be decorative and compliant. Rosalind was certainly the latter, though she performed her duties with the detached efficiency of a hired steward. They moved to Waverley Hall, a massive, drafty limestone estate perched on the edge of the moors. The house was too large. It swallowed sound. Whole corridors had been shut up for decades, draped in dust sheets, and abandoned to the spiders. For the first 3 months, their marriage was a masterclass in polite avoidance. They shared breakfast at opposite ends of a long mahogany table. The only sounds were the clinking of silver spoons against porcelain teacups and the rustle of the morning paper. She would ask about the weather. He would reply. She would excuse herself to speak with the housekeeper. He would retreat to his study. It was a hollow existence, but Alistair could tolerate it. He had his estate to rebuild. He had accounts to balance. Then the rumors started. It began in the kitchen, trickling up through the hierarchy of the staff until it reached Alistair's valet, a loyal, sharp-eyed man named Higgins. "The Duchess, Your Grace," Higgins murmured one evening, carefully brushing out Alistair's worsted wool coat. "She has taken to walking the house at night." Alistair didn't look up from his ledger. "The house is strange to her. She is likely restless." "Yes, Your Grace." Higgins paused. The brush stopped moving. "She walks to the east wing, the sealed corridor." Alistair's pen halted. A blot of black ink pooled on the heavy paper. The east wing had been shut down during his grandfather's time. The roof leaked. The floorboards were rotting. There was no light, no heat, and absolutely no reason for a duchess to wander there. "She carries a basket, Your Grace." Cook noticed some things missing from the larder: cold meats, bread, a bottle of the cheap claret. Alistair closed the ledger. The leather cover slapped against the desk, loud as a pistol shot in the quiet room. "You are overstepping, Higgins." "I apologize, Your Grace." But the seed was planted. Alistair was a rational man, but he was also a proud one. A cynical mind leaps easily to the darkest conclusion. A lover. It made perfect, miserable sense. Rosalind had been forced into this marriage just as he had, but while Alistair had resigned himself to his duty, perhaps she had not. Perhaps the Earl of Lonsdale had bought his daughter a title, and she had decided to keep her illicit romance on the side, smuggling some displaced poet or ruined cavalry officer into the abandoned wing of her husband's own home. The thought tasted like ash in Alistair's mouth. He decided to watch her. Over the next week, The air between them grew brittle. Alistair stopped looking at the ledgers and started looking at his wife. He noticed things he had previously ignored: the permanent tension in her jaw, the way she guarded her pockets, the faint, undeniable smell of camphor and stale smoke on her dresses, smells that did not belong in the meticulously clean drawing rooms of Waverley Hall. One evening, they were sitting by the fire in the library. Rain lashed against the tall windows. Rosalind sat in a wingback chair, an embroidery hoop resting idly in her lap. She wasn't stitching. She was staring into the flames, her breathing shallow and quick. "You seem distracted, madam," Alistair said. His voice sounded loud, scraping against the silence. Rosalind blinked, her focus snapping back to the room. She adjusted her grip on the wooden hoop. "I am perfectly well, Your Grace, only tired." "Then you should retire to your chambers. A full night's sleep might cure your restlessness." She looked at him, really looked at him. For a fraction of a second, the flat, polite mask slipped, and Alistair saw sheer panic in her eyes. It was gone instantly, replaced by the smooth, impenetrable facade she wore so well. "You are very kind," she said softly. She stood, leaving the embroidery on the chair. "I believe I will do just that. Good night, Alistair." She left the room. Alistair waited exactly 10 minutes. Then he poured himself a measure of brandy, drank it straight to burn away the knot in his stomach, and followed her. The darkness of Waverley Hall was absolute. There was no moonlight to filter through the arched windows. The storm outside had blotted out the sky completely. Alistair moved silently. He knew this house. He had played hide-and-seek in these halls as a boy, back before the weight of the dukedom had crushed the joy out of the stones. He reached the landing of the second floor. Rosalind's bedroom was at the end of the south gallery. The door was shut. A sliver of light shone beneath it. He stood there for a moment, feeling like a fool. Perhaps she really was just sleeping. Perhaps the kitchen gossip was just the idle chatter of bored servants. He turned to go back downstairs, ashamed of his own paranoia. Then he heard it, the soft, protesting creak of a floorboard. Not from Rosalind's room, from the shadows at the opposite end of the landing. Alistair turned. He saw a faint, bobbing halo of candlelight moving toward the heavy oak doors that seal off the east wing. He didn't call out to her. A cold, heavy anger settled in his chest, anchoring him. He waited until she slipped through the double doors, leaving them slightly ajar. He followed. The air in the east wing was noticeably colder. It smelled of wet stone, decaying wood, and old dust. The floorboards here were warped, and Alistair had to place his feet carefully to avoid making a sound. Ahead of him, the candlelight flickered, casting long, distorted shadows on the peeling wallpaper. Rosalind was moving quickly. She didn't have the hesitant gait of someone exploring. She walked with purpose. She knew exactly where she was going. She turned down a narrow servants' corridor. Alistair kept his distance, his jaw tight. He braced himself for what he was about to find. He imagined kicking in a door, finding some arrogant, half-dressed man. He imagined the scandal. He imagined the Earl of Lonsdale's fury, the legal battles, the absolute ruin of his pride. He rounded the corner. Rosalind had stopped. She was standing in front of a heavy door at the very end of the hall. She had set her candle down on a small, three-legged table. In her hand, she held a heavy iron key. She inserted the key into the lock. It turned with a heavy, metallic clunk that echoed down the empty corridor. "Who is in there?" Alistair asked. His voice was quiet, but in the dead silence of the east wing, it sounded like a roar. Rosalind jumped, spinning around so fast she knocked her shoulder against the doorframe. The key slipped from her fingers and hit the floorboards with a dull thud. She stared at him. The candlelight caught her face, and for the first time since he had met her, Alistair saw her entirely stripped of her composure. She was terrified. Her breathing came in short, jagged gasps, and her hands were trembling violently. "Alistair," she breathed. "I will ask you once more," he said, stepping closer. His boots sounded heavy on the rotting wood. "Who is in that room?" She moved laterally, sliding her body in front of the door. She spread her arms slightly, bracing her palms against the wood. It was a pathetic defense. She was a foot shorter than him and weighed nothing at all, but her posture was fiercely territorial. "No one," she said, her voice cracked. "It is just old things, my things." "You are lying." Alistair stopped a few feet away from her. The anger in his chest was warring with something else. Confusion. If she was hiding a lover, why didn't the man come to her defense? Why was she guarding the door like a soldier holding a breach? "Move aside, Rosalind. Please." The word punched the air out of his lungs. She wasn't commanding him. She was begging. "Alistair, please," she whispered, her eyes wide, glassy with unshed tears. "Oh, I ask you for nothing. I will be whatever you want me to be. I will stay in my rooms. I will never speak a word out of turn. Just go back downstairs. Let me have this one thing." The raw desperation in her voice made his stomach twist. He hated this. He hated being the tyrant, the jailer. But he was a duke, and this was his house, and he would not be played for a fool. "You sneaked through my halls like a thief," he said, keeping his tone flat to mask the tremor he felt building in his own hands. You steal food from my kitchens. You lock doors in my home. I have a right to know what my wife is hiding." He stepped forward, reaching for the handle. Rosalind threw her entire weight against his chest, pushing him back. The impact was negligible, but the action shocked him so deeply he froze. "Don't open that door," she whispered. The tears finally spilled over, cutting tracks through the dust on her pale cheeks. Unsick, she gripped the lapels of his coat, her knuckles bone white. "If you open it, everything ends. They will find out. Please, don't." Alistair looked down at her hands. She was gripping him so tightly the fabric was threatening to tear. She wasn't just afraid of him. She was afraid for someone. "Who will find out?" he asked softly. She just shook her head, a tight, frantic motion, pressing her face against his chest. She was shaking uncontrollably. Alistair gently unpried her fingers from his coat. He didn't throw her aside. He held her wrists firmly in one hand, stepped around her, and picked the heavy iron key off the floor. He didn't want to do it anymore. The righteous anger was gone, leaving behind a cold dread. But the truth was a localized infection. You had to lance it before it poisoned everything else. He pushed the door open. The smell hit him first. It wasn't the scent of perfume, or stale wine, or sweat. It was the sharp, medicinal sting of alcohol, underneath the heavy, earthy odor of unwashed linen and fever. Alistair stepped over the threshold, pulling Rosalind into the room behind him and closing the door. The room was large, likely an old nursery. A fire was burning weakly in the grate, fighting a losing battle against the damp chill. The windows were boarded up from the inside with thick planks of wood. Heavy blankets had been nailed over the boards to muffle sound and block out any stray slivers of light. In the center of the room, near the struggling fire, sat a man in a wooden wheelchair. He was reading a book by the light of a single, guttering candle. At the sound of the door closing, the man looked up. Alistair stared, his mind, trained to categorize and calculate, blanked entirely. The man was young, perhaps in his mid-20s, but his body had been ravaged. His left leg was missing from the knee down, the trouser leg pinned up in a neat fold. His left arm ended in a stump wrapped in clean, white bandages, but it was his face that arrested Alistair's breath. The left side was smooth, aristocratic, bearing a striking resemblance to Rosalind. The right side was a ruin of burned, puckered scar tissue that pulled his eye downward and twisted his mouth into a permanent, agonizing grimace. The man closed his book carefully. He looked at Alistair with a single, clear eye. There was no fear in his gaze, only a profound, weary resignation. "Well," the man said. His voice was raspy, ruined by smoke or screaming or both. "I suppose the game is up, Rosie." Rosalind ripped her wrists from Alistair's slackened grip and ran to the man. She didn't embrace him. She seemed to know it would cause him pain, but she hovered over him, a frantic, protective bird. "It's all right, Thomas," she said rapidly, her voice trembling. "It's all right, I won't let him. I won't." Alistair felt the blood drain from his face. Thomas. Thomas was Rosalind's older brother, the heir to the Earl of Lonsdale, the golden boy of London society, a brilliant cavalry officer who had died heroically at the Battle of Waterloo 3 years ago. Alistair remembered reading the obituary in the Times. He remembered his father mentioning the tragedy. Lonsdale's only son, blown apart by French artillery. A tragic, noble death. "You are dead," Alistair said. It was a stupid thing to say, but the sheer impossibility of the moment demanded it. The ruined man gave a short, barking laugh that dissolved into a wet cough. Rosalind quickly poured a glass of water from a pitcher on the table and held it to his lips. He drank, then wiped his mouth with the back of his remaining hand. "My father certainly wishes I was," Thomas said, his single eye fixing on Alistair. "It would have been much cleaner for everyone." Alistair looked at Rosalind. She was standing straight now, her tears dried, her chin lifted in that familiar, haughty angle. But it wasn't arrogance anymore, it was a barricade. "They brought him back," Rosalind said, her voice hollow. 2 years ago. He didn't die on the field. They found him in a field hospital in Brussels months later, unconscious, raving with fever, when they finally brought him home. Father saw him. She swallowed hard, her eyes flicking to her brother's scarred face. Thomas stared at the fire, impassive. "He saw a monster," Rosalind continued, the bitterness in her tone corrosive. "A cripple, a horror that would shame the Lonsdale name, an heir who could not ride, could not dance, could not provide an heir of his own. Father said the hero was already dead in the eyes of society. He said it was better to leave him buried." Alistair felt physically sick. The aristocracy was cruel. He knew that better than anyone. Wives were traded like livestock, tenants were evicted for missed shillings, reputations were assassinated over cards. But this, to erase your own flesh and blood because his injuries offended your pride. "He was going to send him to an asylum," Rosalind said. Her voice broke, and she stepped in front of Thomas again, shielding him from Alistair. "A private madhouse in Cornwall. A place where they chain you to the walls and let you rot in the dark." He had the papers drawn up. He declared Thomas legally insane. "I was rather loud when the pain hit," Thomas noted dryly, though his knuckles were white where he gripped the armrest of his chair. "Father doesn't care for noise." "I made a bargain," Rosalind said, looking directly into Alistair's eyes. £50,000, my dowry. Father needed to secure an alliance with you to save his political standing. But I refused to sign the contract unless he gave Thomas to me. Alistair finally understood. The rigid posture at the altar, the cold distance, the absolute lack of expectation in their marriage. She hadn't been mourning a lover. She had been guarding a ghost. "You smuggled him here," Alistair said slowly, piecing it together. "The Waverley estate is vast," Rosalind said defensively. "You told me yourself that half the house was shut up. The staff doesn't come here. I paid the carriage driver handsomely to bring him in the dead of night while you were in London. I clean the bandages. I bring the food. He takes nothing from you, Alistair. He makes no noise. He doesn't exist." She took a step forward. The defiance broke, and the desperation returned, raw and bleeding. "Send me away if you must," she pleaded. "Divorce me. Ruin me. I don't care. But don't send him back to Lonsdale. Don't tell them he is here. If you have a shred of human decency, you will let me keep him in the dark." Alistair looked around the room. It was freezing. The damp was seeping through the walls. He looked at the meager plate of cold mutton and stale bread on the table. He looked at the dirty bandages stacked in the corner. He looked at his wife, a 21-year-old girl who had taken on the weight of an agonizing, terrifying secret, living in constant fear of discovery, completely alone. He thought of his own assumptions, his bruised ego, his petty jealousy. He felt a wave of profound, suffocating shame. He had thought she was cold. She was burning alive. Alistair walked toward the door. Rosalind flinched, turning her head away as if expecting a blow. Thomas closed his eye, leaning his head back against the chair. Alistair opened the door. He stepped half out into the hallway, then stopped and looked back. "It is freezing in here," Alistair said. His voice was very quiet, stripped of all its commanding authority. Rosalind blinked at him, bewildered. "What?" "This room is damp. The chimney draws poorly. It is no place for a wounded man." Alistair looked at Thomas, meeting his single, tired eye. "There is a suite on the first floor, south-facing. It catches the morning sun. The fireplaces there draw perfectly." The room was utterly silent, save for the spitting of the dying fire. Rosalind stared at him, her lips parted, the air trapped in her lungs. Higgins is discreet, Alistair continued, staring at the brass handle of the door. He served in the peninsula before he came to me. He knows how to dress wounds. Proper wounds, not— He gestured vaguely to the torn linens in the corner. Not whatever this is. Alistair, Rosalind whispered. It wasn't a plea this time, it was a question. He finally looked at her. He saw the dark circles under her eyes, the sheer exhaustion etched into the fine lines of her face. I am your husband, Rosalind, he said softly. You do not have to carry your ghosts alone. He stepped out of the room, pulling the door shut behind him to give them peace, leaving the key in the lock. For the first time since his father died, Alistair, Duke of Waverley, felt like he actually had a purpose. Moving a grown man through the dark spine of a sleeping house was not a romantic endeavor. It was a brutal, sweaty labor of logistics. Alistair carried the heavy oak wheelchair down the servants' stairwell. The muscles in his back burned. Behind him, Higgins supported Thomas. The valet had not asked a single question when Alistair woke him at 2 in the morning. He had simply taken one look at Alistair's face, pulled on his trousers, and followed him into the damp ruin of the East Wing. Higgins had served in the 95th Rifles. He had seen the butchery of Badajoz and the bloody mud of Salamanca. When he saw Thomas, he did not gasp. He did not offer useless, cloying pity. He simply braced his shoulder under Thomas's remaining arm and said, "Steady on, Major. Let's get you out of this bloody icebox." Thomas had looked at Higgins, his single eye calculating the man's posture and tone. "Rifles?" "Yes, sir. Now lean your weight on me. Mind the uneven boards." They settled Thomas into the south suite. The room smelled of lavender and old polish, a stark contrast to the decaying nursery. Higgins immediately set to work. He built a roaring fire, sent Rosalind to boil water, and laid out his own shaving kit and clean linen on the washstand. Alistair stood by the door, watching. Rosalind moved with frantic efficiency, her hands shaking as she passed Higgins a basin of hot water. When Higgins unwrapped the bandages on Thomas's shoulder, Alistair had to look away. The skin was angry, infected, and poorly healed. "Carbolic soap, Your Grace," Higgins said to Rosalind, his voice a calm, anchoring baritone. "And I'll need the sharpest paring knife from the kitchen. We have to clear away the dead tissue before the rot sets into the bone. He's going to scream." He did. The sound was muffled by the thick tapestries and the heavy oak doors, but it tore through Alistair's chest like a musket ball. Rosalind sat on the edge of the bed, holding her brother's remaining hand, her tears falling silently onto the counterpane as Thomas bit down on a leather belt. It took 2 hours. When it was done, Thomas was unconscious, his breathing shallow but even. Higgins was washing his hands in the basin, the water stained a rusty pink. "He is strong, Your Grace," Higgins murmured, drying his hands on a towel. "He survived the artillery. He will survive a bit of bad stitching, but he needs meat. He needs sunlight." "See to it, Higgins," Alistair said. "No one else enters this room." "Understood, sir." Alistair walked out into the corridor. The sky beyond the tall windows was turning a bruised, watery gray. Dawn was breaking. He leaned his head against the cold plaster of the wall, feeling entirely hollowed out. A soft rustle of silk made him open his eyes. Rosalind stood in the doorway. She looked wrecked. The severe, perfect Duchess was gone. Her hair had half fallen from its pins, and there were dark, purple shadows under her eyes. She closed the door softly behind her. She walked up to him and stopped. For a long time, she just stared at the lapels of his coat. "What is the price, Alistair?" she asked. Her voice was entirely flat. "There is no price." "There's always a price." She looked up, meeting his gaze. Her eyes were hard, cynical, deeply broken. "My father wanted £50,000 for my compliance. What do you want for your silence? I have nothing left to give you except my life. If you want me to play the doting wife for the ton, I will do it. If you want me to endure your bed, I will do it. Just tell me the terms." Alistair felt a hot spike of anger, not at her, but at the men who had taught her that survival required selling pieces of her soul. He reached out and gently took her shoulders. She stiffened, waiting for the blow or the demand. "Rosalind," he said, keeping his voice deliberately low and steady. I am not your father. I do not traffic in human lives. Thomas is your brother. He bled for this country. He will stay in that room. He will heal. And you. He paused, looking at the exhausted line of her jaw. You will go to your chambers and sleep. That is my only demand. She stared at him. The barricade behind her eyes cracked. The cynical armor shattered all at once. She let out a choked, ragged breath, and before Alistair could step back, she collapsed against him. She buried her face in his chest, her hands gripping his shirt, and she wept. It wasn't a delicate, polite cry. It was the ugly, heaving sobs of a woman who had carried a mountain on her back for 2 years and had suddenly been allowed to set it down. Alistair hesitated for only a second before wrapping his arms around her, pressing his cheek against the top of her head. He held her while she shook, the heavy silence of Waverley Hall absorbing her grief. Over the next month, the atmosphere in the estate shifted. The silence at the breakfast table remained, but it was no longer a weapon. It was a shared, comfortable quiet. Rosalind stopped looking at Alistair like he was a warden. She started asking him about the estate ledgers. She pointed out an error in the crop rotation plans. She possessed a terrifyingly sharp mind for mathematics, a trait her father had undoubtedly ignored. Alistair found himself leaving the heavy leather-bound books open on his desk, silently inviting her input. In the afternoons, they sat in the south suite. Thomas was healing. With Higgins's relentless care and a diet of rich broth and roasted meats, color returned to the scarred side of his face. The infection cleared. Thomas was a brutally sarcastic man. The war had taken his limbs, but it had sharpened his tongue to a razor edge. He and Alistair played chess. Thomas cheated relentlessly. Alistair called him on it. They argued about politics, about Wellington's tactics, about the price of grain. For the first time in his life, Alistair had a home. Then, on a crisp morning in early December, the illusion of safety shattered. Alistair was in his study, reviewing a contract, when the heavy oak door opened. Rosalind stood there. She held a letter bearing a heavy wax seal stamped with the crest of a rampant lion. Her hand was trembling. "He is coming," she said. The blood had entirely left her face. "My father. He is in Yorkshire for business. He expects to dine with us tomorrow evening." Alistair set down his pen. He looked at the letter, then at his wife. The terror had returned to her eyes, dragging her right back to the frightened girl he had found in the hallway a month ago. "Let him come," Alistair said softly. The Earl of Lonsdale arrived in a carriage drawn by 4 perfectly matched greys. He was a tall man, impeccably tailored, with a face that looked as though it had been carved from cold marble. He commanded a room simply by walking into it, expecting the air to clear a path for his ego. Alistair met him in the main hall. Rosalind stood slightly behind her husband, wearing a dress of dark blue velvet. Her posture was rigid. "Waverley," Lonsdale barked, handing his heavy wool coat to a footman without looking at the servant. "The estate looks less ruinous than I expected. Have you put my money to good use?" "The estate is recovering, my lord," Alistair said mildly. He did not offer his hand. Dinner was an agonizing affair. Lonsdale dominated the conversation, complaining about the wigs, the price of French wine, and the general incompetence of his peers. He barely looked at Rosalind, addressing her only once to ask if she was successfully managing the household. "She is an exceptional Duchess," Alistair answered for her, slicing his beef with deliberate precision. "Her mind for the accounts has saved me a considerable sum." Lonsdale snorted. "Women have no head for ledgers. It is a biological impossibility. Do not humor her, Alistair. It breeds insubordination." Rosalind's grip on her silver fork turned her knuckles white. Alistair reached under the heavy mahogany table and placed his hand over her knee, his thumb pressing gently into the velvet of her dress. "Steady." When the plates were cleared, Lonsdale leaned back in his chair, swirling his brandy. "Now, to business," the Earl said, his eyes narrowing. "I've heard troubling whispers in London, Waverley. Rumors that my daughter is reclusive, that you keep her locked away in this drafty barn. A duchess must be seen, she must host. I did not purchase a title for her to rot in Yorkshire." Rosalind's social calendar is her own to dictate, Alistair said quietly. Nonsense. I'm hosting a ball in Mayfair next month. The Prime Minister will be in attendance. You will both be there. Rosalind will wear the Lonsdale diamonds. She will smile, and she will demonstrate the power of our alliance. Lonsdale set his glass down with a heavy thud. Unless, of course, she is hiding something. The temperature in the room dropped. Lonsdale's eyes flicked to Rosalind, cold and reptilian. My man of business mentioned a discrepancy, Lonsdale continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous purr. A rather large withdrawal from the funds I settled upon you, and my servants noted a carriage departing my estate in the dead of night some months ago. A carriage ordered by my daughter. Rosalind stopped breathing. Lonsdale leaned forward. If you have brought some stray dog into this house, Rosalind, I will have it drowned if you have embarrassed me. She has embarrassed no one, Alistair interrupted. He stood up slowly. He picked up his glass of brandy, walked around the table, and leaned his hip against the edge, looking down at his father-in-law. You will speak to my wife with respect, Alistair said. His voice was low, devoid of any anger, which made it entirely terrifying. Or I will have Higgins throw you through the front doors. Lonsdale's face flushed a deep, ugly red. You forget your place, boy. You survived on my coin. And you survive on your reputation. Alistair took a slow sip of his brandy. How is the Cornwall Asylum, my lord? I hear the ocean air is bracing, though I imagine it does little to comfort the men chained to the walls. The silence that followed was absolute. Lonsdale froze, his hand halfway to his glass. The arrogant mask slipped, revealing the terrified small man beneath. I don't know what you are talking about, Lonsdale hissed, but a bead of sweat broke out on his brow. Thomas is upstairs, Alistair stated plainly. Lonsdale stood up, his chair scraping violently against the floorboards. You fool, you ignorant, arrogant fool. If society finds out that monster is alive. If society finds out, Alistair cut in, his voice cracking like a whip, they will know that the great Earl of Lonsdale took a war hero, a man who gave his limbs for the crown, and tried to bury him in a madhouse to spare himself a minor social embarrassment. They will know you forged medical documents. They will know you lied to the king. Alistair stepped closer. He was taller than Lonsdale, broader in the shoulder. He used every inch of his height. The Prime Minister will be fascinated, Alistair whispered. The newspapers will feast for a year. You will not be invited to Parliament. You will not be allowed at your precious gentlemen's clubs. You will be a pariah, a coward who threw away his own blood. He is insane, Lonsdale spat, though he was backing away. He is reading Virgil in the South Suite, Alistair replied coldly. His mind is sharper than yours. Now here are the terms of our ongoing alliance, my lord. Alistair set his glass down. You will leave this house tonight. You will never return to Waverley without an explicit invitation. You will never speak to my wife in that tone again. Thomas will remain here. He is a Waverley now, under my protection. If you attempt to send your thugs, or your doctors, or your lawyers to take him, I will burn your reputation to ash. Do we understand each other? Lonsdale stared at him. The Earl was a predator, but he only understood power. Looking at Alistair's cold, unflinching eyes, Lonsdale realized he was entirely outmatched. The trap had closed. Without a word, Lonsdale turned on his heel. He stormed out of the dining room. 10 minutes later, they heard the heavy front doors slam and the crunch of carriage wheels on the gravel drive. Alistair stood by the table, staring at the empty doorway. The adrenaline was draining out of him, leaving behind a dull ache in his chest. He turned to look at Rosalind. She was still sitting at the table. She was looking at him as if she had never seen him before. He suddenly felt very foolish. He had just declared war on one of the most powerful men in England. He walked back to his chair and sat down heavily, pouring himself another finger of brandy. Well, Alistair said, trying for a wry smile. I suppose we won't be attending the ball in Mayfair. Rosalind didn't laugh. She stood up from the table, walked around to his chair, and stopped. She reached out, her fingers trembling slightly, and touched the side of his face. Her skin was warm. Why did you do that? She asked. Her voice was a bare whisper. Because it was the right thing to do. Alistair looked up into her pale, beautiful eyes. And because he is your brother, and you are my wife. She leaned down. It wasn't a sudden, fiery embrace of a romance novel. It was slow, careful and profoundly real. She pressed her lips to his. It was a promise, a laying down of arms. When she pulled back, the guarded, cynical girl was entirely gone. "Thank you," she whispered against his mouth. Alistair reached up, his hand resting on the small of her back, grounding her, grounding himself. "You never have to lock a door in this house again, Rosalind. Never." Upstairs, the scarred soldier read his book by the warmth of a drawing fire, safe in the light. And downstairs, a marriage of convenience finally began to resemble a marriage of love. If this story of hidden truths and unexpected defiance kept you captivated, please hit that like button and share it with someone who appreciates a real, slow-burn, historical drama. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more immersive stories, where the quietest whispers change everything. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if you found what the Duke discovered behind that locked door? Ring the bell so you never miss our next tale.